All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining the special SABR Joint Chapters meeting, Dusty Baker-Sacramento SABR Chapter and Lefty O'Doul Bay Area Chapter with the Pacific Coast League Historical Society. Pacific Coast League is something very near and dear to my heart, as my great uncle used to be a player in the league in the 30s and 40s. Based on the teams he played for, though, amongst the league teams, I'm actually least familiar with the Stars. So I'm looking forward to tackling a little bit more of this great book from Dan and also hearing more from him tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Arlene. She's going to do a few SABR announcements. Then she'll take it over to Mark McCray, the director of the Pacific Coast League Historical Society, before we get the great presentation from Dan.
Thanks, Zach, and welcome everybody. The Lefty O'Doul co-chair, Steve Treader, is here too. Steve, you want to say anything?
I just want to say hello, welcome to everybody. And I'm sure, like you, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Dan. I was a big fan of Dan's earlier book about the Genovese family and scouting, and Dan was a big source of help to me in researching my book on Horace Stoneham. So it's great to actually put a face with a name and a voice on the phone. So, Dan, I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks.
And I again want to welcome the Pacific Coast League Historical Society. I've spent many marvelous hours at the reunions with you, and I'm really glad that you're here with us tonight. Some very quick SABR and other announcements. You SABR members should have received an email this week that the SABR elections are open, so please take a moment to vote. There's a link in that email. Mark Armour is running again for president, Todd Leibowitz for secretary, and then there's 3 candidates for director, Tara Krieger, Alex Marks, and Tyrone Brooks. So please be sure to cast your vote. You've also seen in recent SABR emails information about the current spring member discount, the opening of baseball better together. This is a membership recruitment drive that offers a 21% discount for any new membership, whether it's student, regular, or my favorite senior memberships through the end of April. So it's a great time to give a gift if you want to give someone the gift of SABR or the PCL Historical Society folks. If you want to join us too, we'd love to have you. You'll also be seeing information about the SABR 50 fundraising campaign coming out soon. Please take a look at that, and I will remind you in emails. Got a couple of books I wanted to just mention briefly. We got an email from our member Larry Baldassaro, who has a new book on Tony Lazzari out, and I believe that is at Nebraska Press. And the new SABR book on Jackie Robinson dropped last week on Jackie's birthday. So that is available as an ebook for members. So please take a look and download it and enjoy it. I also want to remind you upcoming dates for our joint member meetings. On May 18th, Scott Bush, the SABR CEO, will join us and talk about the changes in minor league baseball. It's a really fascinating presentation on how the minor leagues have been restructured, and maybe he'll talk about some of the rule changes that they're looking at in the minor leagues. On June 1st, Steve Treader, our own Steve Treader, will be talking about his new book on Horace Stoneham, 40 Years a Giant, and that's a Tuesday. That same week on Saturday morning, Lincoln Mitchell at 10 a.m., Lincoln Mitchell will be talking about his book on the Giants. I think it's called The Team by the Bay. I'm sorry, I don't have the title with me, but so Tuesdays, except for a Saturday coming up. Really happy to have some things scheduled down the line, and we look forward to you joining us. So Mark, it's all yours.
Thanks, Marlene. Well, welcome everybody tonight. And this is clearly a repeat of similar joint meetings that we've had in the past. Both chapters of SABR here in Northern California, the Sacramento and San Francisco Bay Area chapters have worked together very well for a number of years, putting together a lot of joint promotions. This one is actually nicer because it's the three of us, the PCL Historical Society, which is essentially a spin-off of SABR, and we've all worked together on different promotions in the past and projects in the past. Tonight is going to be a little different. The topic will be on the Hollywood Stars and the Pacific Coast League. We have with us author Dan Taylor, who's researched and put out a wonderful book on one of the most colorful franchises in the Pacific Coast League's history. You'll find the link between three cities, San Francisco, Hollywood, and Salt Lake. And it's like a merry-go-round between those three cities with the Hollywood Club, the Mission Club, and it's just an interesting chapter. What most people agree, even though the earlier Hollywood sheiks had some excitement to them, the golden age was when the Missions moved back down to Southern California, and the Hollywood Stars, that 20-year time frame from 1938 to 1957. That was the most colorful. Many of you have been fortunate to attend some of the Pacific Coast League reunions in the past, where we've had members talk about the fun that they had down at Gilmore Field and Hollywood as well. Just some of the great player stories. But Dan's got a lot to share, and I know Zach already gave it a plug. I'm going to give it another plug. It's a great book. Pick it up. It's good for Christmas, Father's Day, bar mitzvahs, whatever. But definitely get a copy of it for yourself. Dan, the floor is yours, sir.
Oh, Mark, thanks for the kind introduction. And Mark and Zach and Marlene, thanks for this great invitation. And thanks to all of you for joining. It's really great to be part of this joint meeting. And Marlene, I guess this is how you get me to the Lefty O'Doul meetings. Being a member, seems like when I come, it's when I'm speaking. I want to get more involved. So thanks very much. You know, for me, this was such a treat and such a rewarding experience to become involved in researching and writing this book. There were mornings I would wake up and I'd be eating breakfast while going through digitized editions of newspaper articles about the Hollywood Stars games from 1940 and 41. And I think that's the closest that we're going to feel to time travel, you know, sitting down, eating breakfast, reading about the game from the night before. And it was such great fun to be planted and immersed in this research in, like Mark said, the golden era of really one of the great leagues in baseball history, the Pacific Coast League. The Hollywood Stars, there were so many interesting teams in that league. You had obviously the LA Angels at that time, were an incubator for the Chicago Cubs. William Wrigley, PK Wrigley, really experimented with a lot of things down in Los Angeles that they wanted to implement in Chicago. You had the Seals during the Paul Fagan ownership era that were very innovative. Paul Fagan, of course, really was the first to bring a retail store, a team retail store, which is so widely employed now. So I think, of course, Paul Fagan, probably one of his not so bright moments was banning the sale of peanuts one season at the Seal Stadium, but he was a very innovative guy. And then, of course, you had the Hollywood Stars, who really, they were a phenomenon. They were the glamour team of all of baseball. And that certainly was because of the involvement of all the movie stars. They were involved in the ownership group. They were season ticket holders, box seat owners. And on any given night going out there, you had, you know, Bing Crosby, you had Harpo and Groucho Marx, Jimmy Stewart. They were there every single night when you talk to players. And the players would tell you that what amazed them was on joining the Hollywood Stars, finding out that these big movie stars were as big a fans of them as they were the movie stars. And they were very involved. Chuck Stevens spoke of Jimmy Stewart and his wife, inviting he and his wife to their home on many occasions for dinner. Bing Crosby, there were players that talked of Bing Crosby taking them out golfing. Gail Patrick, who was the first wife of the principal owner, Bob Cobb. Gail Patrick, later, after divorcing Cobb, she and her third husband, they had lived in a big estate, and they would invite the players and their families over on the Monday off days for barbecues and pool parties. So it was a very unique environment, and the celebrities were so involved. If you were to go to Gilmore Field on Bat Day, for instance, there's a good chance that Barbara Stanwyck or Gary Cooper would be handing you your souvenir bat as you press through the turnstile. styles. Guys like Bill Frawley, who we know as Fred Mertz from I Love Lucy. Bill Frawley constructed in the ballpark a big, a hall of honor. He did one for the Hollywood players that were away during the war years, did another that showcased the player of the year each year. Of course, he caused a little bit of problems. Bill Frawley was a guy who could empty a bottle as well as the best of them. And there were times when he got out ahead of himself. One season, he offered the managing and the business manager job to Mickey Cochran, the great catcher. The trouble was when word got in the Sporting News and other publications that Cochran was going to be the manager, why it caught everybody with the Hollywood Stars completely off guard until they found that the offer was made at a banquet that Frawley was at, where Frawley had had a little too much to drink. And Bill had to be reined back in a little bit. But it was an amazing time and an amazing environment. But really what that environment, I think, has done is it's overshadowed the true legacy of the Hollywood Stars. And that's as the most, I think, innovative team in baseball history. We touched on Paul Fagan and his innovations with the Seals at Seal Stadium. But when you look at the Hollywood Stars, there's so much they brought to baseball that really, for the most part, they've never received credit for. They were the very first minor league team on March 30th, 1940, to do a game on television. There were only 300 sets in Los Angeles at that time. And in Long Beach, 20 miles to the south, shop owner put a television set in his store window. So many people gathered to watch the Stars opening day game, 1940 season opener, that it spilled out into the street. And the police had to come and break it up because it was blocking traffic. And they were the third team in all of baseball to put a game on television. The Dodgers and the New York Giants had televised a game in August of '39. Hollywood later became very immersed in television, and it was a controversy up and down the Coast League because Hollywood got to televising every single home game. There were a few years where the Angels did as well, and that meant that on any given night during the course of the season, because one of the two teams was always at home in Southern California, you could flip on your television set and watch live baseball. But the other Coast League teams didn't like it because they were getting a share of the gate. They felt that television kept the crowds down. Well, the Hollywood people argued just the opposite. They argued that with so many people moving to Los Angeles and the community growing at such a rapid rate after the war, that this was advertising. They were exposing the product to people in Southern California, and that it was ultimately going to do nothing but help attendance. The Stars were the first team to fly. Baseball really frowned on putting its teams on airplanes, and there were some players that didn't like the idea of flying either, but the American League and National League presidents had told their clubs that they were very worried that flying, if you had an accident, you could lose an entire ball club. That didn't faze the Hollywood people. Coming out of the war, they not only sent their teams by air up to San Francisco and Oakland and to Seattle and to Portland, but they did it by charter. They struck a deal with Western Airlines. There was advertising signs on the fence and in the program, and they struck a deal to use Western Airlines planes, and they chartered the team up to the north. So it was very unique that way. And of course, all of you that know about the Hollywood Stars know that on April 1st, 1950, the Hollywood Stars debuted a very unique new uniform, short pants, and a T-shirt for the top. It was really the brainchild of the manager, Fred Haney, and I think he'd been prodded to it. A columnist in the Times late in the 1949 season had suggested that Hollywood should try to come up with some unique new uniform idea, something that hadn't been tried in baseball. Now, he didn't mention shorts specifically, but Fred Haney seized on that, and Haney said, well, it's working in soccer. They play in shorts in soccer. What's wrong with giving it a try in baseball? And Haney sold it to his players. His players were really unhappy. I mean, some of the guys that were on that club told me that there was a lot of anger in that clubhouse when they broke open the boxes and revealed the shorts. The bat boy, Sandy Oster, I asked him who the most demonstrative were of the angry players, and he laughed and said, it was the guys with the ugliest legs. But Haney sold it to his players on the lighter uniform would make them faster. And Haney coached first base, and in the very first game they used them, I believe it was against Seattle that afternoon, Chuck Stevens was the leadoff hitter, and he beat out an infield hit on the first at-bat of the game. And when the umpire cried safe at first base, Fred Haney turned to the stands, threw up his arms, and said, see, I told you, they work. But a lot of the players Haney employed a running type of game. He liked to steal, he liked to hit and run, he liked to squeeze. And the players, they got upset because the sliding was chewing up their legs. Carlos Bernier was the most vocal about it. And ultimately, after 2.5 seasons, Haney shelved the idea. But they were a real favorite up and down the Coast League. In Seattle, on the first road trip that season, the team took the field in their long pants, and the fans were upset, and they really went into a tizzy over it. And Haney explained after the game that, it was a weather call, that if it was cold, they were not going to wear them. There was a night in Oakland, of course, the ballpark in Emeryville, not far off the water. And there was a night where they took the field in their shorts and their T-shirt tops. And after the first inning, the players came back in and said, "We can't do this. The wind's coming off the bay. It's cold." And Haney let them go back in and change back into their long pants and their flannel tops. And the fans were pelting them and booing. And a number of fans just got up and left because they had come to see the Stars in shorts. So they were a unique team also in food items. One of the things that we see now at ballparks is every season a team will introduce some new gourmet food item. Well, on a much lesser scale, Hollywood was doing that. They started off with something real simple like your basic ballpark peanuts, but they served them hot, fresh roasted, and they put a prize in every single bag. The next year, they decided they were going to sell fresh-made donuts, made-to-order donuts. And then the following season, one of the things they tried was the electrocuted Frankfurter. So where did all this come from? Well, it came from the top. And the guy's someone who may have touched many of you, and you didn't even realize it. But the guy at the top's name was Bob Cobb. And Bob Cobb was the owner of the most famous restaurant in the world at that time, the Brown Derby at Hollywood and Vine. He ultimately had 4 of them, but his base of operation, where his office was the Hollywood and Vine one that was up the street from where the studios were, and it was a mecca for the radio stars and the movie stars for lunch and dinner. And how has Bob Cobb touched all of you? Well, many of you, I should say. Well, Bob Cobb, there you go, Sandy, you got it. Bob Cobb brought to us the Cobb salad. And we've got that story in the book, and I've gotten to know Bob's grandson really well, and he's promised me that when all this lifts, he wants me down to his home for an authentic Cobb salad dinner. I think that's a great reward for all this. I'm looking forward to it. But Bob Cobb was an interesting guy. He was a sportsman. He grew up in Montana, loved baseball, but also hunting and fishing. He was an avid trap and skeet shooter. He competed in the national championships. He loved to get together with Clark Gable and Harpo Marx, and they would go to a ranch and they would steer rope. He was a baseball fan. He would go to Angels games and was appalled at the quality of the food that was served there. So in November of 1938, when Herbert Fleischhacker, who was the owner of the previous missions, Mission Bells, Mission Reds, San Francisco missions that had moved to Southern California and become the Hollywood Stars for the 38 season, Fleischhacker had gone broke. He'd lost some major lawsuits and had to liquidate. Bob Cobb's attorney secured an exclusive negotiating window, and Cobb jumped at the opportunity to buy the ball club. He got on the phone, and in a day and a half, he had rounded up 20 investors, and they raised $200,000. The first call he made was to Cecil B. DeMille, the legendary director, and then he just went down his list. Bing Crosby, Barbara Stanwyck and her husband, Robert Taylor, on. And Gene Autry was one, and they had a huge gathering of celebrities that helped them pull together $200,000. $40,000 bought the ball club, and it was a terrible ball club. So bad economically that in the 38 season, they had to forfeit one game when their equipment trunks didn't get loaded on the train. And when they got to the destination and didn't have it, they had to forfeit the first game of a road trip. The Pacific Coast League fined them for it. And the team couldn't pay the fine. They had to sell the contract of a player to raise the money in order to pay the fine. But that all changed when Bob Cobb put his investment group together and they bought the ball club. So they raised $200,000, $40,000 bought the club. It was a distressed sale. $50,000 was set aside to buy ball players. And then $100,000 went to pay half the cost of building Gilmore Field. They partnered with an oil man and land developer, Earl Gilmore. He also put up $100,000. He provided the land, a 20-year lease, and supervised the construction, and they built this 10,000-seat ballpark. Cobb brought the philosophies he used at the Brown Derby to Gilmore Field in his operation of the Hollywood Stars. He always believed that celebrities wouldn't complain about problems that they had. They simply wouldn't come back. And so when Gilmore Field was built, and it was at 3rd and Beverly, which is where the CBS complex is located now, next door to the Farmers Market, which the Gilmore family still owns and operates. When it was built, he put a VIP lounge in for the celebrities. They had an orchestra playing. They had an open bar and a buffet meal before games. The type of boxes he put in, which we have pictures of in the book, they were patterned after both Hollywood Bowl and the Hollywood Park Racetrack, where they had backing and a side and a little bit of privacy to them. They were much different than what you saw at ballparks. He was all about cleanliness. He had a crew circulating the ballpark inside and out, picking up cigarette butts and wrappers. And I've often wondered, because Walt Disney was an original box seat owner, and you see that same philosophy at the Disney parks. And I've often wondered if that's where Walt Disney got that idea from, was his times at Gilmore Field. As I mentioned, Bob Cobb was a stickler about food quality. He hated ballpark food. He had derogatory names for the peanuts, the type of hot dog buns that they served. And so when he took over the ball club, he clashed with his food service director, a guy named Danny Goodman, who later had the same job with the Los Angeles Dodgers. Goodman was all about buy cheap, sell high, and Cobb wouldn't have it. Cobb wanted real milk buns, for example. He was a stickler about the fat content in the ice cream, and he clashed with his wife about it. He wanted a high fat content in the ice cream, and he wanted meatless hot dogs, meatless Franks. He was just a huge stickler for the quality of the food, and many of the amenities of the ballpark. I mean, he outfitted the ladies' rooms like the ladies' rooms in the theaters that had spare makeup and sewing kits and attendants, things that you just didn't see at ballparks at that time. There are some innovations that Cobb brought to the game that we do see now. And I should bounce back that another thing that was, I think, kind of unique that Cobb did in two particular areas. When I mentioned that they had $50,000 set aside to improve the club and buy ball players, the first two players he bought were bought with a purpose. His manager had already left for the winter meetings before the sale went through. They were able to get a hold of the manager, who was told he had no money to spend at the winter meetings. And when he arrived, he heard from Cobb that he had now bought the ball club and he had $50,000 to spend. So the first guy he went out and bought was Bill Sissel. Bill Sissel, the second baseman. They got him from the New York Giants, but Sissel had been an all-star, previously with the White Sox, and he became very popular. In fact, during the 39 season, he got fined by the president of the Pacific Coast League, and it so incensed some of the movie stars, Gary Cooper was one, Barbara Stanwyck, George Raft, that they chipped in and paid Sissel's fine. But Sissel was their first buy, and then Babe Herman was the second buy. And these were huge because Cobb, he understood the Paramount Studios concept of star power. His first wife had been a part of it. She was a very popular actress in the 30s. And so Cobb understood it. And so by buying Sissel and particularly Herman, who was from the area, was a legend in the area and was extremely popular in Southern California, he brought in star power. Buying them brought instant credibility to that ball club that had been so bad in 38, and it was box office. Herman was very, very popular. And Herman played with them up through the 1944 season, had a couple of huge seasons at the plate for the Hollywood Stars. So Cobb was always thinking of these types of ideas and operating in a very different fashion. He also employed as his business manager a guy named Oscar Reichow. And Reichow had previously run the LA Angels until a falling out, and Cobb snapped him up to be the business manager. And he was the business manager for a good 10 seasons with the club. And he was a very innovative guy. He was as a sports writer in Chicago, he was the guy that identified, recruited, and championed Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis to be the commissioner of baseball. He was very instrumental in and the creation with Cobb of the California League. That minor league was a Hollywood Stars idea. They wanted it to be a minor league just for the 6 California-based Pacific Coast League teams. It was started in 41. Actually, this week is the 80th anniversary of the league's first week of operation. And then World War II sent it on a hiatus with a lack of players. And then after World War II, the major league clubs saw the benefits of developing talent in California, and with their offers, they aced out the Pacific Coast League clubs. But you still see, I think now it's low A West, but all these years, 79 years, the California League has been a lasting legacy of the innovativeness of the Hollywood Stars. Some of the things that we see in baseball today, that middle of the 5th inning groundskeeper coming out and grooming the infield, grounds crew grooming the infield. Well, that came from the Hollywood Stars. They had pitcher Jack Salveson in 1950, and Jack was at the end of his career, and he was a guy who worked very, very fast. He wanted to keep hitters off balance. But it also meant games were 20, 30, maybe even longer, shorter than any other game that Hollywood would play because Salveson worked so quick. So they were trying to figure out the best way to combat that because their revenues were down on the nights that Salveson pitched. And Cobb raised the idea of trying to create a 10-minute intermission. And the idea of what they could do to force this intermission was to bring out the grounds crew. They pitched it to the Coast League. The Coast League turned them down. They then went to the head of minor league baseball, and he turned them down. They took it to the Baseball Rules Committee, and they received permission to experiment the last half of the 1950 season. Well, by 1951, everybody in baseball was doing it, and they have been doing it ever since. One of the other things that came from the Hollywood Stars that we see now on a regular basis is Dodger Stadium. In 1952, Cobb felt strongly that he had to build a new ballpark. Coming out of World War II, in 1946, the Pacific Coast League made a concerted effort to try and gain major league status. Paul Fagan, Seals owner, was one of the major guys to push that. Pance Rowland, who was the president of the Coast League at that time, really championed it hard. And the league, over several successive seasons, made a very strong push to try and gain major league status and to become the 3rd major league. Each time they did, they were shot down. When Ford Frick became the commissioner, he took a different tack than Happy Chandler had done prior. Ford Frick developed criteria for gaining major league status. The Pacific Coast League met many of those, but the one area that they fell short was the quality of their ballparks. The Angels Park, Wrigley Field in Los Angeles, that met major league standards. Steel Stadium was pretty close, but they were landlocked, and that was going to give them some trouble. But the rest of the parks in the league, not a chance. Now, Cobb put together an initial plan to increase the seating of Gilmore Field from 10 to 20,000, but Earl Gilmore shot it down. He couldn't see getting his money back if he was to spend on expanding the ballpark. So Cobb had been invited up to the police academy up in the hills north of downtown LA. And the police chief wanted his advice on putting in a kitchen and developing a banqueting program. Cobb got walking around the area and was immediately struck that he had found the perfect place for a ballpark. He brought Bill Schroeder, the longtime sports historian in Southern California. He brought Bill Schroeder with him a day or two later, and they surveyed the area, and Schroeder agreed that it was the perfect place for a ballpark. Cobb then engaged an architect from Pasadena, Styles O. Clements, and together they designed what they called a super modern ballpark. This park had 2 restaurants, cocktail lounge, childcare, escalators from the parking lot up to the box offices and the turnstiles, and what Cobb called cabanas, which was not done in baseball at that time, but it's now done everywhere in arenas and stadiums. We know them as luxury suites, skyboxes, whatever term you want to use. It was an amazing concept, and they went to the city, and the city was lukewarm. They didn't really believe that the Coast League had a legitimate chance at gaining major league status. They felt their best bet was to bring in an existing club, and that perhaps they could just use Wrigley Field or maybe the Coliseum. So Cobb didn't get a lot of help from the city. He went and spoke to the county supervisors, and one of the supervisors was very eager to work with Cobb, but he wanted him to build in a different area, and Cobb wasn't keen to do that. He felt that the best place was Chavez Ravine. Well, when the Philadelphia A's were sold and ultimately moved to Kansas City, that was a huge turning point for Los Angeles in their effort to bring in a Major League Ball club. There were a number of businessmen who told the press that they were going to buy the A's and bring them to Los Angeles. But when all was said and done, Del Webb, the owner of the Yankees, let the hierarchy in Los Angeles know that the men that had come back had no plan for a ballpark and never revealed their financing. So the mayor of LA immediately, the press excoriated him, and he had a press conference to try and calm this problem down. And he announced that he had a plan. He had a plan to build a ballpark that would bring a big league club to Los Angeles. And he held up a drawing, and it was a drawing of Cobb. It was Cobb's drawing. He had basically taken Cobb's plan. So Cobb knew that he was a beaten man. He knew that the city wasn't going to support, and he pleaded repeatedly for the city to support the Pacific Coast League. And the city just had no confidence in it. In 1957, when Walter O'Malley came out and made his fact-finding tour of Los Angeles, he had told the city leaders that he wouldn't meet with any of them until he first met with Bob Cobb. So not long after Mr. O'Malley's arrival in Los Angeles, he met with Cobb in his suite at the old Stadler Hilton Hotel, and Cobb brought all the papers. He brought the blueprints. He brought the drawings. He brought the maps of the area showing that one day 3 freeways would service Chavez Ravine. And Cobb, O'Malley was sold. He came out of that meeting, and he announced that he had learned more from Cobb than he had from any city leaders in the years that he had been thinking about Los Angeles. And he was locked into Chavez Ravine as the site for his ballpark. And that dismayed some with the city. There were some that wanted to divert him into Wrigley Field, and O'Malley wouldn't go for that. There were others who felt that the Coliseum was a good long-term solution, and O'Malley said that it was a short-term solution, but it was not a ballpark. It would not work for the Dodgers. So ultimately, when he came, that meant the end of the Hollywood Stars. They came close to staying put and moving down the road to Long Beach. A city councilman made a presentation at the end of the 1957 season to the Coast League owners meeting. Caught everybody off guard because nobody really knew a lot about Long Beach. And when they started looking at the numbers, they were very impressed. The Dodgers had bought the LA Angels and planned to move them north to Spokane. And Buzzy Bavasi tried to change midstream. When he saw that, he thought, if we put our team in Long Beach, we can save a lot of money. And the Long Beach Council agreed that they would only play on Dodger off nights. They would only have home games when the Dodgers were out of town. But ultimately, things were changing in the Coast League. We had seen the Oaks move to Vancouver, and there was a northwestern shift in power in the Pacific Coast League. A group from Salt Lake City wanted to try and buy the Hollywood Stars, and Cobb was actually out of the room to take a business call. And when he was out, they hastily put together a vote and voted to allow the Salt Lake City group to buy the club. And Cobb really lost his negotiating power on that. The club was sold. Cobb said he didn't want to be the bad guy, so he just accepted the offer, which was a lot lower than what he had hoped to get for the club. And the Hollywood Stars moved on to Salt Lake City, and the 20-year run of the Hollywood Stars came to an end. But it was a remarkable run. It was not just a remarkable 20 years for the Hollywood Stars, but the entire Pacific Coast League. One of the things that has really struck me through this process was that for people up and down the West Coast, that was the big leagues. That was their big league baseball. And it really crushed a lot of fans, particularly younger fans, when the Dodgers and the Giants came west, and their Seals and their Oaks and their Angels and their Hollywood Stars left, and the Coast League changed forever. So I appreciate the opportunity to share that with you, and thanks for the kind words, and certainly open to questions. And Marlene, I'll jump on yours first, because there were certainly players in the Pacific Coast League. I think Steve Bilko's name comes to mind, that didn't want to go to the big leagues because they were very, very well taken care of. Babe Herman, for example, he was Mr. Holdout. He was the king of the holdouts. And there was a particular year where he held out, and to be able to help him out in the way he wanted. They gave him an ownership stake in the ball club. It was against baseball rules. They put it in the name of a family member. But these players, George Genovese shared with me that after playing in 49 and going to Washington in 1950, the major league minimum was $5,000 a season, and that's what the Senators gave him. And George balked at it and said, I made $6,000 in my first season in the Pacific Coast League, and the Senators wouldn't budge. So players like playing in the Coast League because the compensation was a little bit higher than even in the big leagues. Open to thoughts or questions.
All right, if you have any questions for Dan, please, you can either speak up, make sure to be cautious and courteous of others if you try and speak over them, or you can also type your questions in the chat.
Perry, I saw your question. Good to see you. Thanks for that. I can't recall the name of the Salt Lake club, but they weren't there for very long before they moved, or maybe I might be confusing that with Phoenix. The Giants moved to, yeah, that's right, the Bees. The Giants bought the Seals as well in a swap with the Red Sox. They swapped Minneapolis for San Francisco and took them to Phoenix. And I believe that club, the Hollywood Stars, is now the Tacoma Rainiers in the Pacific Coast. Well, that's not the Pacific Coast League either. Well, another habit I've got to break this baseball season.
How do we get the book?
It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Roman and Littlefield is the publisher, and it's on their website as well.
Thank you.
Did the Tom, you've got an interesting question here, and there have been a couple of other chat questions I'll jump back to, but I'll jump on Tom's first. Did the Angels and the Stars have a rivalry? I've talked to players who played in the big leagues with either the Giants or the Dodgers and also played in the Coast League for either the Stars or the Angels. And they've all said the same thing to a man. The great Giant Dodger rivalry, one of the greatest in all of sports, was nothing compared to the rivalry between the Hollywood Stars and the LA Angels. It was very intense. It started when Cobb bought the club, and the Stars had been in their offices had been in the Angels tower at Wrigley Field. And when Oscar Reischau was hired to run the Stars, well, they kicked the Hollywood Stars people out of the tower. It was intense. You had the amazing battle in, I believe it was 55, the Sunday doubleheader between the two teams at Gilmore Field. Frankie Kelleher was the hitter, and they threw up and in on him a couple of times and then drilled him in the back. Well, Frankie Kelleher was such a soft-spoken but a big guy that his teammates called him Mouse or Mousy. And he simply dropped his bat. He didn't sprint to the mound like we see today. He dropped his bat, calmly walked to the mound, and when he got to the pitcher, he hauled off and punched him in the chest. And they told me that the pitcher flew 6 feet back in the air, landed on his keister, and by the time he landed, both dugouts were on the field. When they got that brawl broken up, they resumed play. Kelleher was the only one kicked out. Teddy Beard went into pinch run for him. I think he was sacrificed to second base, and then he stole third base. And when he stole, he went in spikes high, slashed up the Angels' third baseman. Here we go again, Donnybrook all over. This time, the Donnybrook lasted for 30 full minutes. The chief of police happened to come home from a day at the beach, turn on television, and the screen fills with this melee at Gilmore Field. He immediately gets on the phone, calls the riot squad, orders them to go to Gilmore Field to break this brawl up. Chuck Stevens shared the story that between games of the doubleheader, he walked back into the clubhouse and saw a guy in a suit, plainclothes suit, standing in front of his locker, and he hollered at the clubby to get him out. The man turned, flashed his badge, and introduced himself as the head of the riot squad, gathered the whole ball club together, and told them that these were the ground rules for game 2. Nobody was to leave the clubhouse except the 9 who were on the field, or a catcher and a pitcher who was ordered to go warm up in the bullpen. Nothing took shape at all in the second game of the doubleheader, but by Monday morning, the upcoming series between the two that was a couple of weeks down the road scheduled for Wrigley, well, the phone lines were burning up and tickets were selling out fast for the next game between those two teams. It was a very intense rivalry between those two. I'm going to jump into the chat and look at some of these other questions. Eddie
Yeah.
Urat, I want to jump there. Bruce's question about Eddie Urat. Yeah, he did go back to San Diego, but Eddie Urat was an amazing story with Hollywood. He was one of the group of young players that they were able to bring in. They had high hopes for him. And then when he was away during World War II, they were desperate to bring in a third baseman, and they made a deal with Cincinnati and brought in a third baseman and offered the Reds first option to buy Eddie Urat. When Eddie Urat came back from the war, he became Hollywood's first 20-game winner. And several times during the season, the Reds tried to exercise their opportunity to buy him. And Hollywood pointed out that the contract stipulated that they couldn't have him until after that season. But Eddie Urat really didn't let people know that once he got to Cincinnati, pretty early in his time with Cincinnati, he hurt his elbow. And he was called the next Bob Feller when he was at Hollywood, but he got hurt at Cincinnati and really wasn't the same guy. Finished up in San Diego and ended up living the rest of his life in San Diego. No, Danny Kaye had no involvement with the Stars. You're right. He was a huge baseball fan, part owner of the Mariners, but no, he did not have any ownership stake in the Hollywood Stars. They did allow overflow crowds to stand. They would particular games. Yes, you're right, Benjamin. They would rope off the outfield. There was no warning track back then. They would rope off the outfield if they expected an overflow crowd, and they would put a couple thousand fans. Generally just in front of the left field wall in a roped off area. My research, wow. It was a blast, Marlene. It really was. And it was an emotional roller coaster, I have to share. I mean, certainly I read a lot of articles, people sending me stuff, friends that found out what I was working on would send me things, and spent a lot of time going through digitized editions of Southern California newspapers, and a lot of time in libraries in Northern California, going through collections. The Dick Dobbins collection had some tremendous stuff, some recordings, some interviews, transcripts. It was great. The librarians there in San Francisco were fantastic. The emotional roller coaster was getting to know a lot of the former players, and also the family members of former players. The exciting part was these conversations with the children and grandchildren of former Hollywood players. And what struck me was what incredible pride they had. I mean, in many cases, their parent or their grandparent had gone on to play in the big leagues, but what they were so proud of was that they were part of the Hollywood Stars, and they loved to recite the stories they had been told, and the friendships that their parent or grandparent carried through their life of Hollywood stars, of the celebrities, the relationships they had. That was really something that I was really taken by. But the tough part of it was, I had some wonderful conversations with guys like Chuck Stevens and Jimmy Hardy, the former NFL quarterback who was the Stars' first ball boy, grew up just blocks from Gilmore Field.
How about Paul Pettit?
Pardon?
How about Paul Pettit?
You just took the words out of my mouth, Jim. Paul became a great friend through my work on the George Genovese book. And Paul and I talked every couple of weeks for several years. And when each of these guys would pass, it just tore my heart out. It was crushing. And particularly Paul, I had just talked to him a couple of days before he had his stroke. And he was sharing one of the funniest baseball stories I had ever heard. And to lose him it was tough. That was a tough part of the book. But what I also enjoyed was how excited they were that these stories were going to be told, and they too had great pride in their time with the Hollywood Stars, and were excited about that being shared, and the reason for their pride being shared with other people. So it was a real rewarding experience, Marlene. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. I don't know the name of the lumber company Eddie Urat was at. Darn it. Good question. I didn't follow through with where he worked after his career, Bruce. I did speak to exchange some emails with his son, and his son had a few stories as well about some of the celebrities that he befriended, and what a fun time he had with Hollywood.
Dan, I don't know if you saw it there in the chat, but there's a question about the racial integration of the Stars in the Pacific Coast League.
You know, I'll touch on that. Thanks, Steve, for bringing that up. On record, the Hollywood Stars were one of the last teams in the league. I think the seventh of 8 to integrate. In 1951, they made a trade with San Diego for Roy Wellmaker, who had pitched with the Homestead Grays and also was a big star in Venezuela. But in reality, what I was struck by, I came across an interesting story, and it involved quite a lot of research to try and confirm this. But there were stories in the LA Eagle, the California Eagle, which was the African-American newspaper in Los Angeles at the day. And it was about 2 high school kids that were being signed out of a Hollywood tryout camp. And what was really confusing to me was that the articles talked about them being signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, Brooklyn was just at that time becoming, through Fred Haney's work, the Dodgers major league affiliate. But the tryout camp was something at Sawtell Field that Hollywood had done for years. And the scout who brought them in and signed these 2 players was Rosie Gilhousen, who was the Hollywood scout. And later, he became a legend. Scouted when Hollywood was sold and Pittsburgh was the parent club. Pittsburgh took him on as one of their scouts. So I was really confused. And actually on a visit to the Hall of Fame, I went through the player cards to try and see if I could get clarification. In particular, the player that I'm speaking of, his name was Eddie Moore. And Eddie Moore was a really good high school player in Los Angeles. Initially went to Tuskegee Institute to play football, but his father died. He came back home to help his mother out and was at Los Angeles City College. And he played on a team that was called the Eagles. The Eagles were an all-black team in LA semi-pro league, which was just huge at that time. A lot of big league guys played. I talked to guys who played against the Eagles, said they were a really talented team. Their benefactor was the drummer in Count Basie's band. And their coach tipped off Rosie that the St. Louis Browns had been asking about Eddie Moore. And he was a pretty good size 6'1", 6'2" center fielder. And so Rosie brought him to this tryout in front of Fred Haney at Sawtell Field, and Rosie signed him. And they brought him in initially to Hollywood spring training, and very quickly, within a day or two, decided that he was overmatched and they needed to farm him out. Hollywood had created a farm club. They had started from scratch the Billings Mustangs. That was Bob Cobb's adopted hometown. And so they sent him up to Billings. Well, he was the very first African-American player to play in the Pioneer League. And where I finally got clarification was from Gar Myers. I don't know if Gar ever attended any of the reunions, but Gar was Paul Pettit's high school catcher. And Gar was signed by Rosie Gilhousen for Hollywood. And in Billings, Gar was Eddie Moore's roommate, and they became really good friends. And Gar was very adamant to me that the Dodger information that he signed with the Dodgers initially was incorrect, that he was signed by Hollywood. So in January of 49, which the signing of Eddie Moore would have been the second, I believe, I could be wrong now, but it seems as though he was the second African-American player signed by a Pacific Coast League team, but he never played for Hollywood. And the reason that I found out why Eddie Moore later shows up in the Dodgers organization, it was explained to me, and then I did finally find some articles and some paperwork to confirm this. Hollywood, Bob Cobb became very close with Branch Rickey when they became a Brooklyn farm team. When Branch Rickey left and went to the Pittsburgh Pirates, Hollywood told his successor, Buzzy Bavasi, they wanted to break the agreement and move to become a Pittsburgh farm club. Buzzy Bavasi demanded a dozen players as compensation for breaking that agreement. Gar Myers was one. Norm Sherry, who had signed with Hollywood out of Fairfax High, was another. That's how he got into the Dodgers organization. And Eddie Moore was the third of the third player out of those 12. And Eddie Moore ultimately got to AAA very quickly. He had some big years. He was at Billings for 2 years. His second year was huge. He was a great power hitter. And Gar Myers told me that at Minneapolis, or St. Paul was Brooklyn's farm club, he was the victim of a terrible beating, and he was never the same. Brooklyn released him. He went to Mexico. He had a couple of big power years in Mexico. They brought him in 1959. Pittsburgh brought him to Salt Lake City, for that about half the season, and then he was ultimately released and didn't play again. So, yeah, I think in terms of a player playing for Hollywood, yeah, he was. Roy Wellmaker was the first to suit up for Hollywood, and that was the seventh of eight. I'm in the middle of another book right now that really gets a lot more deep into that situation in the Pacific Coast League, and it's really quite interesting about the war years and efforts that went on to try and integrate, and the player that Oakland and LA and Hollywood was really pushed to try and sign was Kenny Washington, the football legend, who was an even better baseball player. But that's for a talk in a year and a half when that book comes out.
Oh, Dan, can I interrupt for a second? We have a couple of people I'd like to point out on the screen here. We have one PCL alumni who joined us at our last PCO reunion, Don Farber from the Oakland Oaks. And Don, thanks very much for joining us tonight. I wanted to welcome you. If you want to unmute yourself and say a couple of words to everybody, that would be great. Zach, can you unmute him?
I don't have the ability to. I can ask to unmute, but after I do a mute all, I cannot do a individual.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Don, you'll have to hit that button at the bottom of your screen that says unmute and mute, and just click that, and that'll get your voice working on it. There you go. I think you got it. Oh, nope, you muted it again.
Playing in Salinas, and there was the $100,000 bonus baby, Paul Pettit, and they were trying. I guess he blew out his arm, and maybe he was trying to make a first baseman out of him. And his wife was having a baby. Now he got a $100,000 bonus. I'm sure he didn't get it all at once, but the entire stadium and the players on both teams didn't make $100,000, but they wanted to pass the hat around to buy Paul Pettit's wife a gift. That was one thing I remember, other than Chuck Estrada, who was a pitcher on that team as well. Yeah.
That's great, Don. Thanks for sharing. Now, there's over 50 people at the meeting tonight, so I've been going back and forth to the different screens throughout the meeting, and I noticed the family of a very good friend of mine that's on, and unless they're calling in from Oleggio, Italy, it's got to be Rugger's son. If you want to say a few words, I certainly miss Rugger quite a bit. We used to get together all the time, and he was a great guy.
Yes, hi, this is Bill Artazoya. Indeed, Rugger was my father, and he passed away in 2016. And he's mentioned a couple of times in Dan's book, which I thought was really great. What I point out to the members of on the call is that they did a great interview from the New York Times in 2016, and if you Google it, you'll come across it, Rugger Artazoya, New York Times. And at the time, he was the oldest living Yankee. He had a cup of coffee there in 1947, where he faced the the dreaded St. Louis Browns, and he actually grooved a pitch, I think, to Walt Judnick, his old buddy from the Mission District in San Francisco, and that was kind of the end of his Yankee career. But he was named to the All-Yankee, All-Italian team, not because of those 2 innings, but the fact that he was the only Yankee at the time actually born in Italy. So that was a real high point, but he lived baseball, and to the day he died. And so I appreciate the recognition. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, Rugger was the greatest right-hander to come out of Commerce High. And at one time I owned a restaurant, and Rugger was the linen salesman.
That's right.
So he's quite a guy.
Yeah, he could tell a story or two, couldn't he?
Yeah, he was really good. In fact, you talk about that article in the New York Times, and the guy that did it, whose name is escaped me right now, a young guy, but he really did his homework. And Bill, your dad, the last 5 or 10 years of his life, every time he would have an interview, he would call me up. He had told me so many of his stories that I remembered. When he would forget something, he'd look over at me and I could fill in the words that he was missing and get him right back on track. And I remember when the New York Times reporter came over, and we were both talking about it a few days in advance. This kid's not going to know anything on baseball. And the kid shows up, and he's in his late 20s. Louis Lazar is his name. And Louis was really, really good. He wrote a very good article. He was very respectful to Rugger and told everything the way it was. But it was a lot of fun, and it was great to see him get that recognition there. We were also involved with another friend through the PCL Historical Society, works with the baseball program at San Quentin Prison. And Rugger was given a day out there, and he went out, threw out the first pitch, and the inmates, again, treated him with unbelievable respect. The line was 40 or 50 long, and they were bringing pieces of toilet paper and pieces of cardboard to have him sign, and he talked with every single one of them. And it was such a kick. I know he had gone there back in the 50s when he was playing semi-pro ball, as a lot of guys had done, and played in the prison back then. And we were talking about it before and after that event, and how things had changed in the 50 or so years since he had been in there. In the 50s, when outside teams would go to San Quentin, you weren't allowed to exchange any words with the inmates that were on the baseball team or elsewhere. But yet at the end of the game, you'd go to the shower and you'd be next to the inmates in the same shower, which is pretty dangerous. And of course, in modern times, when you see these guys on the field, they're all handpicked. It's not the axe murderers and the arsonists and such like that are dangerous to society. But you'd swear that you're in a convention of accountants in Minneapolis or something, where it's the mildest group of guys that are there, and they're pretty open about what they did. But again, they were very, very respectful to Rugger, and his friend Lynn Adams had joined us that day, and it was really a great experience. But Bill, I really appreciate you joining tonight, because I think the last time I saw you was at the cemetery the day of his funeral.
Very well. Wasn't Rugger the last of the Mitchell Reds?
He was, yes.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Actually, Dan had given me an invitation because I had contacted him after reading the book and seeing my dad's name in it. So I did make contact with Dan. And so for Dan, thank you for the invitation.
Bill, I just wanted to say it means a lot that you're here tonight, and your call and our frequent emails these last few weeks have meant a lot to me, and I'm grateful. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I'm sorry I wasn't wearing my Hollywood Stars cap tonight. That's downstairs, darn it.
Hi, this is Leo Smith.
Do you have a question? Leo, if you have a question, we can't hear you.
I can jump through some of these in chat real quick while we wait for Leo. But first off, Steve Heath, Carlos Bernier, he wasn't just one of your least favorite guys. Not many guys on the Hollywood Stars liked him either. And it's really sad. He obviously he had the incident where he punched the umpire and was suspended indefinitely. It really tore him up as well, but it ruined his reputation. He did get up to Pittsburgh very briefly, had hamstring problems that year, and never really got another shot at the big leagues. Such a volatile player throughout his career, and I think the sad thing is that later, I think that it was really traced back to a beating that he got in his first season in the States playing with the Tampa Smokies, and ultimately he committed suicide. Just a real tragic story because he was an extremely talented player. Steve, your thought about the schedules? Absolutely. And to kind of tack on to the George Genovese story, when George was complaining to Clark Griffith of the Senators about their contract offer, that's what Clark Griffith threw back at him. You know, you made more money in the Coast League, but you played more games too. You played 50, 60 more games than we do in the big leagues. So yeah, the schedule was amazing. Charles, thanks for your comments on the Genovese book. That was a real labor of love. I loved it. And Tim, I appreciate that as well. And I'd love to chat with you sometime a little bit more about Eddie and his son, William. That's great. Greg, that's one of my frustrations in my research. Greg asked if I've ever seen the architectural plans that Styles Clements produced. And I searched high and low. I contacted his grandsons, who are both architects now, one in the San Diego area, one still in Pasadena, and no luck there. I went through the California Association where plans get registered, and I just had no luck everywhere I turned to try and find those plans. Now, a few years later, when Branch Rickey was trying to bring about, I believe it was 1960, the Continental League, Mark Scott, who was the Hollywood Stars radio broadcaster and the host of Home Run Derby, Mark Scott put together investment with Chuck Connors and Joe Friday, the actor. Somebody help me. The actor on Dragnet all those years. Anyway,
Jack Webb.
Jack Webb. Thank you very much, Jack Webb. And they pursued a franchise in the Continental League for Los Angeles. And at their initial press conference, I found pictures of Mark holding up a stadium design, and my curiosity was whether that design might have been what Styles Clements designed for Hollywood, but I didn't have any luck tracking that down. So they've got to be out there, and I really wanted to find that to put in the book, and unfortunately didn't have any luck on that, darn it.
Has there ever been a thought of having a Dodger Angel retro game in the Stars and Angels old uniforms?
Boy, I'd love to see that. And I did a talk recently where somebody brought that up as well, Sid. I shouldn't have said that because you deserve all the credit for that great idea. But they've had Hollywood Stars games, but they're just games involving celebrities at Dodger Stadium. But it would really be fun, I think. I think everybody probably that has seen the different uniform look through the years probably has a favorite. But I love Gail Patrick had a hand in designing their home and away 1939, 1940 uniforms, the first of the Cobb ownership group. And I love those uniforms. And I think it would be a lot of fun if the Dodgers would do a retro game and wear those uniforms someday.
The A's, the Giants, and the Mariners have done the turn back the clocks and have recognized the PCL a number of times over the years.
Right, but the Dodgers never have, and I'd love to see. Of course, the Angels have strictly stayed to Major League Angels throwback uniforms, and not necessarily the Coast League Angels. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see them do that. I'd love it. Yes, Tom Nahigian, your question about the schedule, and Mark, I know you know this and can elaborate on this as well, but for many, many years, the way the schedule was structured was a team would be in a city for a week. Monday was always your travel day. The series would run Tuesday through Sunday, and the Sunday game would be a doubleheader. And so if you were going to Seattle, you'd spend the week in Seattle, and they'd basically go 2-week road trip. They'd go up and do Seattle and then Portland right after. So yeah, you would spend an entire week playing 7 games in 6 days in that particular city.
Well, Dan, we really do appreciate your time. And I will make sure that this is posted and available on YouTube within the next couple of days. For those that do not have it, make sure to pick this book up. It's in stock on Amazon. Get it within a day or two on Prime. Definitely worth the purchase. You definitely will enjoy it. Dan, we can't thank you enough. This has been a great evening, and we've been lucky to have you grace us with your presence and share those great stories.
My treat. Thank you, Zach. I appreciate it very much. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night, and we look forward to having you join us on our next one.